Welcome to part 3 of how to negotiate your jewelry. In parts 1 and 2, we talked about this common misconception that negotiation involves a lot of conflict and disagreement, but how actually the most successful negotiations start out in agreement, continue through other places where you already agree, and then end up in a final agreement. And agreement does not necessarily mean that everybody gets exactly what they want, but it typically means that you have created a mutually beneficial situation throughout the negotiation. And the first thing we want to do is start by establishing our first agreement. And that first agreement is typically that we agree to negotiate. So we want to set ourselves up for success when we negotiate. And typically that means negotiating in contexts where it is socially acceptable to negotiate. You don't want to start off your negotiation on the wrong foot by insulting someone inadvertently. And typically, the places where it is more socially acceptable to negotiate would be like in a case where someone is reselling jewelry that they themselves didn't create. If they are an artist or if they're someone who has poured a lot of love and skill into learning the art of making or creating jewelry, it's typically not socially acceptable to negotiate in those circumstances because it is seen as devaluing the effort that that person has put into their craft. And establishing consent sort of helps us not make a social faux pas because you can always ask ahead of time and give the person the opportunity to opt out of the negotiation if they don't want to, or if you have misread the situation and maybe thought it was socially acceptable, but it wasn't to them. What you want to do is say something like, would you be open to hearing an offer? Are you open to negotiating on this price? Something like that to give the other person an opportunity to opt in or out of the negotiation process. Once you've established that first agreement that we have agreed to negotiate, then you also may have established some other agreements just in the process of talking about the piece. For example, you may have agreed, we both really like this piece. That's something we can agree to. You may have agreed on some sort of timeline. For example, if it's like a ring and you need it to be resized for a wedding or something like that you have coming up in a couple weeks or a couple months, you may have already had a conversation about whether or not that piece could be resized in that time frame. So those are some other agreements that may already be established. And that puts you in a really good position to start talking then about the rest of the levers of this negotiation, namely the price. We'll go into details of how to establish maybe your first offer on price in a future video, but these agreements that we come to in the very beginning are super important and they're going to help the rest of the negotiation go super smoothly. Thanks.